Well, good morning. Good morning. See, I'm from Nashville, and usually when I say good morning, it erupts even more. I thought you were a little more energetic than my Nashville colleagues. So I'm going to try again, just to make sure. Good morning. Good morning. All right. Great. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, especially to be among so many people who I think care very deeply about creating communities where people with and without disabilities have opportunities to worship and to learn and to serve and to live life right alongside one another. So, I think at first glance, it's probably, I might seem like an odd choice for a gathering like this because I'm an educational intervention researcher at Vanderbilt University. And much of my work focuses on identifying those skills and those supports and those experiences and relationships that young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities really need to flourish in their schools, in their workplaces, and in their communities. But I think as you'll see as we go through this morning, if you spend enough time focusing on trying to help people with disabilities flourish, the conversations you have eventually turn to things like friendships and to families and to faith as well. And so my time this morning, what I want to do is share with you an early glimpse of what my colleagues and I are learning about the faith and the congregational connections of young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. And I want to give you some ways to reflect on where you are right now and where you might go next in terms of welcoming and weaving people with disabilities into the life of all that happens in your congregational community and in your broader community. If you're not familiar with the phrase developmental disabilities, you had a great overview here. Those are young people with labels like Down syndrome and intellectual disability, autism and multiple disabilities. I think so often within our professional circles, these are young people that we know by their need for intensive or ongoing support to participate in everyday life activities. We often think of them in terms of their cognitive impairments or in terms of their complex communication challenges. I'm going to really push you to think today not about people in terms of what their labels are, but in terms of what their gifts and their strengths and what their names are, and really challenge you to think about welcoming people one person at a time rather than welcoming groups of people with certain labels. So these are young people who have wonderful gifts to share, but they're just not known in our schools, in our workplaces, in our communities, and I think so often, regrettably, also in our faith communities. So the title of the talk is Incomplete Without You, Receiving the Gifts of People with Developmental Disabilities and Their Families. Now, underlying all that I'm going to share this morning is a real strong belief that communities of faith are incomplete without the presence and the gifts and the contributions of people with developmental disabilities. And that many people with disabilities are missing out on something essential when life is lived on the peripheries or the edges of their communities or even outside altogether. I think this is reflected in the scriptures that guide my own tradition, the idea that people with disabilities, people without disabilities are indispensable to the flourishing of our communities. Every part dependent on every other part, the parts we mention, the parts we don't, the parts we see, the parts we don't. If one part hurts, every other part is involved in the hurt and in the healing. And if one part flourishes, every other part enters into the exuberance. Last year, I was driving my son to school, and I passed this church sign on the way to school, and I thought, that congregation gets it. And you'll have to sort of connect that to that verse. But for those of you that are members of congregations in which people with disabilities and their families are missing, I want you to think about what your next steps might be throughout this day. And think about what you might have to gain by learning to welcome more widely and more wildly throughout your community. Now, I want to start by quickly dispelling a myth that I think often underlies a lot of the conversations I have with congregation members. And you've probably heard this too. I hope you don't hear it very much. The conversations include some variation kind of on this phrase. Well, we would love to welcome people with disabilities into our church or our synagogue or our mosque, but we don't have any people with disabilities. If we did, we would welcome them really well. Have you heard variations on that, right? So perhaps maybe the simple explanation is, well, there aren't people with disabilities in our community. Well, I would encourage you to think about this question. What would people conclude about who lives in your city or your town if all they had was a glimpse of who gathered in your congregation on Sunday morning or Saturday morning or whenever you worship, right? What would they conclude about who lives in your broader community if they looked at your congregation? Are people with disabilities really among my neighbors? Well, of course, the short answer is what? Yes, right? There are 7 million Americans with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They live in every single community across the country. It's about 2 to 3% of any community kind of fits that description. Cuts across every single demographic variable, race, ethnicity, economic status, geography. It's a natural part of the human condition. I think that's an empirical statement. It's a theological statement too. And so let me have you do some math. Is that okay on a Friday morning? A little bit of math? All right, so it seems like you have about 1.8 million people who live here in Tarrant County, right? Roughly. That means there are more than 36,000 people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in this county alone. And I bet I'm underestimating that by a large amount. And if about 19% of all Americans have a disability, that means in this county alone, there's as many as 340,000 people with disabilities living in communities all around our congregations and our workplaces and elsewhere. And that translates actually into about 1 in 3 families has a relative with a disability. So how many of you are part of a congregation that has more than 1 or more than 3 families in it? All right, a couple startup congregations here, right? That means that disability is a reality already in your congregations, whether you notice it or whether you don't notice it. So you start to think, well, what's 19%, what's 1/5 of the population of my neighborhood or my town or my city, however I define that. And then I start to think about who gathers in my congregation and all the congregational activities that we do. And is there a gap, a distance between who gathers and who resides in the communities that surround my congregation? So if you're interested in stats, you're going to have a great morning because I'm going to share a lot with you. And if you're not, there's still coffee out there you can go grab. But this is just a breakdown of any given community, the percentage of people of different age groups who have a disability from the U.S. Census. So, 45, if you're age 45 to 54, 1 out of 5 people have a disability. 65 to 69, 1 out of 3. 75 to 79, half. Over 80, 70% of people with disabilities. I share this because on the previous slide I used the phrase temporarily able-bodied. That describes all of us. Disability is part of the human condition. It will be part of ours as well. And so how are we responding as people of faith to that reality? Now, those numbers probably seem really abstract, and some of you are not too into graphs. So I want to put them in very concrete terms. What would happen if we walked outside together from this particular seminary and we walked into the neighborhoods that surrounded this building? And we can't actually do that. So last night I rented a drone and I took some screenshots for you. This is what would happen if we walked out of the building. This is what it would look like. We're right there in the middle. And if we started to go out into the communities that surrounded this particular seminary and we started to knock on doors, this is what we would find in terms of who would answer those doors. Nearly 1 out of 3 or 4 households that we knocked on in this neighborhood would be a family impacted by disability. Isn't that striking? Nearly 1 out of 4. So my point is, if people with and without disabilities are not encountering one another in our congregations or elsewhere, it's not because people with disabilities aren't in our midst. And so many faith community members just aren't aware of the presence of people with disabilities because their lives so rarely intersect, not at work or not at community events, and so often not at church. So the challenge is if we start to wait to think about accessibility and welcome until someone comes to our congregation, we've already waited too long. We've got to start to think about how we reach out wide and deep within our communities. And that's just one neighborhood. I was going to spend the rest of the morning walking through every single neighborhood, but you get the point, right? So my sense is that there are still invitations yet to be extended out in our communities, and I wonder why that is. Maybe one of the reasons we're so reluctant to extend invitations has to do with how we view people who are strangers in our faith communities. I think so often we struggle to see people with developmental disabilities in terms of their strengths and their gifts and the faith that they would have to bring to our community. I think that's a challenge for many of us. But what are those strengths? What are those talents and those gifts that make young people with disabilities so indispensable within our communities? And how would you even find an answer to that question? How would you know what someone's strengths and gifts are? So, of course, I did what any university professor would do in advance of coming to a faith community conference. I went and looked in our sacred texts about what the gifts are of people with disabilities. Here's some of those texts up there. Those are not what you had in mind, right? Those are professional journals. That's why I put sacred. Oh, I should have put it in quotes. You don't go to the peer-reviewed literature to find out what people's gifts are, right? You learn about people's gifts how? You spend time in the lives of and learning the stories of young people with disabilities and their families. And if you were to do that long enough, you'd find there's some incredible gifts. But if you looked at the perspective that our service systems have on disabilities, you struggle to see people in light of those gifts. And let me illustrate that. Think about how we so often talk about young people with disabilities in professional circles, almost always in terms of what people cannot do. And you saw some of the definitions from the DSM-5, and these are some definitions on the screen of intellectual disability and autism. You don't have to read all the way through, just look at some of the things that I've bolded. What do they highlight? They highlight almost everything that someone struggles to do or cannot do. And so when a congregation starts to think about, well, how do we welcome people with autism into our youth group? How do we include someone with significant intellectual disabilities in our worship services? And all they have to work from is this image of a person and what that person with that label can't do. You can see how they would struggle to figure out, how do we welcome well? It makes for a challenging introduction. It's hard for us to envision someone who is just sort of made up of a list of deficits. So where I'm going with this is how we introduce people, I think, is going to matter. What if instead of introducing young people or thinking about them in terms of what they can't do, we introduce them on the basis of the strengths and the gifts that they have to bring to community? And can you think about young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in this way, as having gifts waiting to be received? Well, a lot of you are parents in this room of people with disabilities, and it turns out that parents can. We just finished last year a study that involved 450 parents of young people with intellectual disabilities and autism. And we asked them to complete something called, you'll like this, the Assessment Scale for Positive Character Traits. Right? Can you believe there's actually such a scale? And if you're not sure what your positive traits are, I'm glad to administer it to you at lunch or something like that. But it's great. It's actually a positive assessment. It asks about 26 different things that address things like the extent to which your child shows characteristics like kindness and humor and gratitude and empathy and optimism and forgiveness and courage. So why does that matter so much? Well, let me show you just a glimpse. Bear with me on this graphic up here. But when we asked parents, and I'm going to summarize this for you, about the extent to which their child, these characters are like their child, here's the percentage of parents who said, yes, that's exactly like my child. We asked, do you think your child is happy? Look at that, 93% of their parents describe their child as being filled with joy. My child enjoys life and is thankful for life's simple pleasures. 86% of parents said, that's exactly like my child. My child has a great sense of humor. My child can be thoughtful and helpful to others. My child shows caring and compassion for others. My child shows thanks for help from others. My child is bothered and concerned and upset when someone's uncomfortable or distressed. I think my child is courageous. My child bounces back easily. My child doesn't retaliate or get back at others who've hurt him. And my child doesn't lose his temper. And I know what you're thinking, that's only half of kids fit that description. This is a study of adolescents and young adults, so not a lot of adolescents are really good with self-control. But I share this why. Can we find a place for these kinds of strengths in our workplaces and in our schools and in our congregations? I'm sure you can. I mean, how many businesses would benefit from hiring someone whose qualities like honesty and persistence and optimism, right? How many faith communities can find a place for someone known for their gratitude or their empathy or their kindness? And how many neighbors in our communities would be eager to develop a friendship with someone who was funny or happy or thoughtful? How many of you are clergy in here or right? How many of you would love to have a congregation filled with people with these traits, right? So I share that because there's a group of people who would love to have some invitations extended. If you want to fill your congregation with people with wonderful gifts, they're out there in our communities. And I think it matters then how we think about and how we introduce people. One of the challenges that we have is often to get educators and congregational leaders and others to think first in terms of people's gifts. I've never met a congregation that can't find a place for someone's gifts. And so I think that's where we have to really challenge people to have as a starting point. So we don't turn to the peer-reviewed literature. You don't go to journals to figure out strengths. We learn about those by sitting alongside people, and we listen to them, and we learn about their strengths and their struggles and their friendship and their faith when we do that. And I wanted to share a bit about some of the things that I've heard and the things that I've learned as I have had conversations with young people with developmental disabilities. And the first is this, is a big general takeaway, I think. It's that the presence of a disability is not at all a reliable predictor of people's aspirations for their lives. Let me say that again. The presence of a disability is not at all a reliable predictor of what is important and what people desire in their lives. And it's definitely not a reliable predictor of people's faith. Whether that labels a developmental disability or a visual impairment or anything like that, we so often use labels to highlight what's different about two people. But I think when we think about inclusion, it's far more helpful to think about what people with and without the labels of intellectual disability or autism have in common, which is really almost everything. Because like every one of us in this room, a person with intellectual disabilities is going to need support to live a good life. Please raise your hand if you do not need support to live a good life. Should be 0, but usually there's 1 or 2 people who will kind of raise their hand, right? We were not designed and created to do life on our own. The difference isn't our need for support from one another. The difference is that support has to be a bit more intensive or deliberate or more lasting for young people with intellectual disability. But we share that need for support. And like every one of us in this room, a young person with Down syndrome is going to have wonderful strengths and gifts that exist right alongside any limitations. The difference is that so often those capacities and those contributions get unrecognized. And I think that happens in our faith communities too. We perseverate on the challenges and we miss the contributions. Our starting point is the wrong place. And like every one of us in this room, a person with autism is going to struggle in some contexts. But they're absolutely going to shine in some other context. And we heard a couple examples of that in just even hearing about the definitions. People struggle, but they shine in other places. I feel like our charge as faith communities in some ways is to find those places where people can shine. And so often the labels highlight what we can't do, rarely what people have to give. And so we tend to think of people with disabilities so often as the focus of our ministry, rather than ones who are doing ministry. And that's a challenge for us to have a different perspective than that. And I think last, like all of us in this room, people with disabilities want to grow in faith together with others, to belong to a community, and to know and be known by people who share their deep love for God. And the difference you'll find in just a moment is that so often that aspiration doesn't find opportunity. There's a difference between what people want in terms of their faith and the connections and the opportunities and supports to realize that. I hope you all came here knowing this intuitively, but it's sometimes good to know there's a study that backs it up. The presence of a disability label is not a predictor of people's faith either, not the importance of it. In a recent National Organization on Disability survey of Americans with disabilities and Americans without disabilities, virtually the same percentage of people with and without disabilities considered their faith to be somewhat or very important in their life. There's no difference between those two bars. But there is a difference when you start to look at how involved people are in the life of their congregation. By show of hands, I'm going to embarrass some of you. How many of you attend a church or synagogue or mosque at least once per month? All right, those of you whose hands are not raised, clergy, you can kind of talk with them at the lunch, right? Pretty low bar, right? This is clearly not a representative group here, right? In that same survey, they found that 57% of people without disabilities attended some place of worship at least once a month, but only 43% of people with significant disabilities had that same kind of involvement. So there's a gap between these two numbers, right? They call that the participation gap. And I'd actually point out when you look at this, there's multiple gaps. There's a gap in participation, but there's not a gap in faith. And there's a gap between people with disabilities who want to share their faith in a community of believers and those who have the opportunity to do so. And frankly, there's big gaps in our community for anyone who are struggling to find a place that will really welcome them and they'll fit in. So how do we explain that gap? Certainly not faith. We've debunked that myth. What is it that stands in the way? Are there barriers of architecture or access or attitudes or awareness, or simply barriers of invitations not being extended? I really want you to encourage you to think about what stands in the way in your own congregation or your own community. And of course, I have a few ideas, and according to this picture, only one of them is a bright idea, but I want to share them anyway. Every congregation, all of you, I don't know your particular congregations, but you probably have a different pathway here. And so what I want to do is really highlight a way of reflecting on how your congregation is demonstrating welcome and hospitality and encourages this sort of community. There's a lot of great reflection tools out there that can help you think about what your starting points are and what your next steps are. I'll point you to some throughout the rest of the presentation, and there's some in the book that you have as well. But I want to use the remainder of my time to highlight one that I find often most helpful. And this is a reflection approach that I learned from a guy named Bill Gaventa, who's now a transplant Texan. And to share this well, I have to actually do something that may be traumatic for you, so I apologize. But I need to take you back to elementary school. Is that okay? Do you remember in elementary school when you used to diagram sentences? Yeah, here come the groans, right? You have to take that sentence and break it up into all the different parts of speech, right? And you thought, this is never, ever, ever going to be useful for me. Well, here's where it becomes useful, because there's one part of speech called a preposition that I think is really important. And it was that word that illustrated the relationship between two things. I want you to think about a movement of prepositions as we think about how our congregations interact with people with disabilities in our community. I think that right now, much of what happens in our congregations and our ministries, our divinity schools and seminaries, and our communities of faith so often is happening apart from people with disabilities. And as congregations are stirred, they sometimes begin to think about establishing ministries to people with disabilities or for people with disabilities. Perhaps they even start to open their doors and welcome people with disabilities and their families, and ministry starts taking place among people with disabilities. Hopefully they start to discover the richness of ministry with people with disabilities, and just about everyone I know who's been on this journey long enough very quickly starts to talk about ministry by people with disabilities. Do you see how that preposition maybe matters in all of this? How do we move from ministry apart from to ministry to think about ministry among, ministry with, and ministry by people with disabilities? That's where I want to turn really the rest of my time and kind of illustrate a bit about each of those postures. How many of you probably come from congregations that have a reputation. Actually, all of you come from congregations that have a reputation. Hopefully it's a good one, one for hospitality and for grace. But I think collectively, our track record as communities of faith has been somewhat uneven, sometimes stellar in some places, and sometimes very disappointing. I think so many of our sanctuaries aren't really places of sanctuary for people with disabilities and their families. And too often, ministry happens apart from people with disabilities. They're not present in our pews. They're not involved in our religious education classes or our youth groups. They're not on our leadership teams. They're not at the potluck dinners, and they're not speaking from the pulpit. I think we've got to do better than that. We can't be in that place. We don't have national data at all on the extent to which people with disabilities are involved in congregations specifically, or we don't know the number of churches and synagogues and mosques that have at least one person with a disability. But I'll tell you what we do know is we spend a lot of time crafting statements saying why we ought to move past ministry apart from people with disabilities. And I think a written commitment is really important. But I think that's not enough. In fact, we have plenty of resolutions and position statements saying this is important. And just to entertain you, I have gathered them all. And these are the position statements that I've said that are challenging us, whatever denomination, to be about this kind of welcome, right? All kinds of well-written, well-crafted statements about why we should be places of hospitality and sanctuary and community. So those are important, but what can you point to very concretely that demonstrates your congregation's commitment to being that place of welcome? When your congregation's talking about reaching your community, are you really thinking about your community in its broadest sense, or do we tend to define community too narrowly? I think a statement from this pastor kind of reflects the tenor of a lot of congregation responses. He says it's not that we deliberately excluded them. In fact, we weren't deliberate at all, and that was the problem. So what's happening in your congregation right now? If it's ministry apart from people with disabilities, I really encourage you to think about 1 or 2 steps that you might take on this journey to better welcome this segment of your community. As you're listening to the panels throughout the morning, listen for starting points and ideas and next steps that you might take that starts to change the paradigm in your congregations. So one of the starting points in lots of congregations is often ministry to people with disabilities and their families. And there are a great many needs that need to be met, and congregations can be instrumental in meeting those needs. You might know these stats, but the poverty rate for people with disabilities is twice what it is for people without disabilities. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities is 1/3 what it is for people without disabilities. Twice as many people with disabilities don't have adequate transportation as people without disabilities. There are great opportunities to meet very practical needs in our community, and I think congregations can be part of that. This afternoon, I'm going to lay out some very simple things you can do beyond Sunday morning that really help people with disabilities and their families to flourish. I think a lot of our congregations shine when it comes to outreach. If you were just to kind of map all the things you do in your congregation to meet the physical, social, emotional needs, the spiritual needs of people in your congregation, and you say, how do we make sure people with disabilities are also benefiting from those outreach efforts? I think that's an important first step, and I think it's one we're called to really take. We all have times when we need to be ministered to, and that's certainly something we can do. I would really love to see the congregations in this particular city work in tandem, to work in concert together, to meet needs that exist all throughout this region. Just to kind of illustrate the power that could have, I took the time last night to put a dot where every single church and place of worship is in this city. And it looks, if you can see it, it looks like someone has chicken pox. There are enough congregations here to really change the landscape for people with disabilities. If you're noticing that your church is not in large letters, it seems like you're not paying enough money to Google. That's my guess. So I don't know how that works, right? So listen, ministry too is important, but if outreach and ministry too is your stopping point on that journey, I think we've missed out on something really important. We can do acts of service, we can do acts of outreach, and they can benefit people profoundly, but I don't think that providing services or monies or resources is enough. We can meet people's material needs and their instrumental needs and remain at arm's length from them, but if we do that, we never meet their deepest needs, which is to belong, to be in relationship, and to be part of a community. We can't do that from a distance. I think bringing services to people with disabilities is not the same thing as bringing people with disabilities into community, and that's really what we can shine at as faith communities. So if you would describe what happens within and through your congregation as ministry to people with disabilities, if that's where you are right now, I want you to be strengthened in the work that you're doing. Providing care is really important, but I want to challenge you to go even a little bit deeper on that journey. And what might that look like? Well, I think that's ministry among people with disabilities. My very simple recommendation is simply to be generous with new invitations, to throw your doors wide open, and to strive to welcome and weave people with disabilities into the life of your community. I think this is what makes ministry among people with disabilities possible. And the great thing is the starting point requires no advanced degree, no special training, nothing. It simply takes an invitation, it's followed by a welcome, probably some sort of hearty handshake, and it's something that we all know how to do. Right? Unless you're at a congregation that has a hospitality team and they're responsible for hospitality. But hopefully you all see that as your role, right? So I don't think it should be, hospitality should not be the sole responsibility of the hospitality team, right? All right, so I would just say that if you're going to extend these invitations, you also want to prayerfully reflect on the presence of barriers that might keep people from actually receiving that invitation and acting on it. There are still barriers of architecture and access in congregations. And I've put on your screen what I thought for a long time was the most inaccessible congregation in the world in Germany. It's built literally into the side of the mountain. And then someone shared with me, no, there's actually one in Italy that's a little more inaccessible. And I thought, that's pretty bad, look at that. And then someone else shared with me one in Georgia that is completely inaccessible. Although it does apparently have some sort of elevator system, it looks like. So interesting, right? What does our architecture say about our theology? It's an interesting thing to think about. What does it say about who we expect and want to gather with us on Sunday morning or Wednesday night? And I would actually encourage you to think beyond architecture of your building, but where are all the places where life happens together? In our congregation, we gather in sort of small groups, life groups throughout the week. But are there homes that are accessible to people with disabilities who want to be part of those kinds of congregations? Accessibility really ought to be a fundamental commitment. So I think that's where we are more and more, that we've sort of gotten past the ramps as being the barrier. But I still love this quote. It's from more than 30 years ago by Harold Wilkie. He says, in Las Vegas last year, in 5 different casinos, I asked 5 different people in wheelchairs whether they had encountered any barriers to their entrance to the casino. The answer always being no. Should there be? Gambling casinos, okay. Churches, no. Why is it easier to get into so many public places than in so many congregations as well? And so we start to think about what are simple things we can do that make that more accessible. Things like this last step going into this building can speak profoundly, again, about your welcome. This quote from Ed Wood is really great. It says, if shut-ins can go to Walmart, but not to your church, they're shut out, they're not shut in. And so how do we think about overcoming those architectural barriers that make sure people really can worship among us and with us as well? Sometimes it's a simple ramp. But so the challenge here is just to think about where are all the places where life happens in your congregation, and are there unnecessary barriers to people's participation there that prevent them from being part of this place? Think beyond the walls of your sanctuary to the classrooms and the meeting rooms, the fellowship areas, the restrooms, the playgrounds, all the places where people gather and worship together. In your books, we've got a little reflection tool that you can use to have a team kind of walk through your congregation and offer some feedback on places you could make it more accessible. There's also some wonderful accessibility checklists that you can download, put out by different denominations. They're not denominational specific, and they talk about what this might look like. Those are also in your handouts. And there are other, certainly, aspects of accessibility for people with chemical sensitivities, allergies, others. You see signs here reflecting how this information is communicated to people. My very favorite is the shush-free zone. If you have kids, you love to be in a congregation which has a shush-free zone. It's a place where no one's allowed to turn to you and say, shh, be quiet, right, in worship services. And it reminds me of a colleague who shared a story about a pastor who, it was a congregation I think had an individual with autism who would sometimes call out during the worship service. Maybe he would answer the pastor's rhetorical questions, which in some traditions is great, and others not so much, right? And so I think the pastor had approached this person and said, to person who knew him, and said, listen, we're really glad he's part of this place, but it can be a little bit distracting, the noise. And we do have this wonderful cry room in the back. It's got a window to it. The sermon's piped in. Would it be okay if he worships there? It's important that he's in our congregation, but, you know, what do you think? And my colleague had a great response. I think he said something on the variation of, that's a great idea, but I've got another idea. What if we take all the people who can only worship in complete silence and we put them in the cry room and we let the rest of us worship freely with a little bit of noise? So it gets a chuckle, right? But what it's doing is it's saying, what are the barriers we're erecting that really maybe don't need to be real barriers? So anyway, all that to say is we start to think about those things that make ministry among us possible. I really think the big thing is not the accessibility as much, but the lack of invitations so much for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we often don't think about this. I mean, most churches, they do lots of advertising, they do lots of announcing and lots of invitations. But I'm not sure that what we consider to be an invitation is always actually received. There's a difference to me between an announcement and an invitation. How many of you show up at weddings that are just announced, but you weren't actually invited? Right? A couple of you are wedding crashers, I can tell, right? A couple of you, right? So maybe one of the best ways to increase the presence of people with developmental disabilities is simply to invite them. And maybe the general ways we invite people don't always reach people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So, I mean, how do most people come to your congregation for the first time? It's because someone invited them. It's usually not because they found it in the yellow pages. It's someone made that invitation. So we want to think about how we do that invitation. There's passive invitations, which is like simply, listen, we're welcoming, and you notice that, and that should be a cue to you to come. There's those active invitations where we really reach out and let group homes and service providers and others know that, and families, that we want them to come. And then there's those personal invitations that say, hey, Sam, it's important that we want to get to know you. We want you to be part of this place. Come and join us. I think that announcement versus invitation can look different. This is a couple shots from our church parking lot. This to me is an announcement, and this to me is an invitation. So one of them says, we're thinking about you. One of them says, we're thinking about you, and we expect that you're part of this place. A few years ago, you make that sort of more passive announcement in a lot of ways. This may not look familiar to you because about 10 years ago, I went through the Madison, Wisconsin newspaper, and I cut out little ads from churches. Do you all remember what newspapers are? There were these physical things that would show up on your, yeah. So, but little things just were a cue to families that said, hey, you know what? That church is thinking about me. So if I go there, I might actually be welcomed rather than turned away or wounded. There's lots of ways to do that. Very quickly, I just did a search in the area of local congregations and special needs ministries. Churches started coming up. Families are looking for those cues that say, hey, you're thinking about me. You might be ready to welcome me well. The kinds of symbols that we put in our brochures and all things cue people to the accessibility features that we might have in our congregation. There's a number of accessibility symbols and a place you can download those if you want to include in your materials as well. And one of the things that I think is kind of really interesting is some communities are starting to band together and saying, hey, let's make kind of a resource map of all the congregations in our community that are welcoming of people with disabilities and the supports that they offer, so that any family that moves to our place, to our community, can find a congregation that will support them well. In Virginia, at Hampton Roads area, the Faith Inclusion Network started to map all the congregations that were there so someone could find a church that matched their denomination, and it also listed each church and all the accessibility features that they had. Sign language, children's ministry, respite care, a whole range of things. So that's maybe something you might think about as a community. Is that something we want to do to make sure collectively we're meeting the needs of people in Tarrant County and elsewhere? But like I said, an invitation is just an announcement unless it's actually received. And so how do you really spread the word to people with intellectual disabilities? Maybe it's going out to independent living centers and group homes, parent support groups and others, and letting them know you really want to invite them to what you do in your congregation. 75% of people who come to a worship service for the first time are there because someone invited them. That's just national statistics. That's also true for people with disabilities. And if you don't know where to find people with disabilities, this room is filled with people who are working with agencies who have those connections and with family members, but I've also put on your screen and in your book a list of organizations that serve people with disabilities in just about any given community. So I would say, though, that invitation, just because you extend it, don't assume automatically that it's going to be responded to. You may have to ask more than once, because not every family has had the same history you've had when you walk into a congregation. In one of our studies of almost 500 parents who had children with developmental disabilities, we asked them, have you ever changed your place of worship because your child was not included? 1 out of 3 families had left their church or other place of worship because their child wasn't welcomed. I share that because it means many families have felt wounded, and they may be a little question whether or not your welcome and your invitation really is what it appears to be. So, we often have the posture in our church of, listen, we want to welcome you well. We're going to do the very best we can to make Sunday the best morning for you and your child. We might mess it up, but we're going to give it our best shot. And that posture goes a long, long way to families. I think sometimes a commitment to hospitality is going to require you to do things a little bit different. It may challenge us to explore some ways of doing congregational activities with everyone in mind. Might challenge us to think about some new ways of preaching or worshiping or teaching or gathering together. There might be some old traditions we want to bring back, maybe some less reliance on all of our written and spoken words, supplementing with sights and symbols or drama, dance, movement, those sorts of things. The interesting thing is when you start to make your worship services more accessible for people with disabilities, they end up actually being more accessible for lots of people. I met a pastor a couple years ago who told me about his efforts. They had a number of kids with autism in their church. They wanted to change the worship service a little bit more, have some more kind of visual cues and just some things to make it a bit more comfortable for some of the students, children with autism there. And they were, the pastor responded, really kind of do things a certain way here, but you're welcome to use a fellowship hall like this in the basement and to do the service there that kind of really is more flexible and accommodating for children with autism. We'd love you to do that. So they did that. Within a year, he told me, there were more people worshiping in the basement at that service than upstairs, and they flipped it and went back up. What they learned is, as they started to broaden kind of how they thought about worship, they ended up reaching a lot of people. I think that's a recurring lesson of inclusion, that when you make your community more welcoming for people with disabilities, you make it more welcoming for everyone. So I would say if what happens right now in your congregation is ministry among people with disabilities and their families, celebrate what's going well and start to think about, now, how do we go even further on this journey? I want to be really careful that ministry among people with disabilities doesn't mean ministry that's parallel to people with disabilities. When a congregation only offers separate Sunday school classes or Sabbath school classes or separate worship services or only specialized activities for people with disabilities, I think that our lives never intersect, even though we're attending the same congregation. I really challenge you to think about, how do we not just be in the same place, but really be in the same places together? And that really introduces another sort of important difference in terms of prepositions. You can offer a ministry or Bible study for people with intellectual disabilities, or you can have a Bible study with people with intellectual disabilities. You can pray for people with disabilities in your community, or you can pray with them in your sanctuary for your community. You can create a separate space for people with disabilities to worship, or you can try to design a space that enables you all to worship together. And I think doing things for and with also is quite different things. Because when you do things for people, it can transform them. When you do things with people, it puts you in a position to be transformed as well. So how do we do ministry with? In part, I think it has something to do with how we welcome people when they first enter our doors. What they encounter may determine whether or not they really want to be with this community. And they're very practical things you can do. I put in your handouts and in the book some examples of some tips for greeters and ushers who might be a little uncertain about how to welcome people with disabilities and their families. Some guidelines for clergy or ushers or lay leaders about how to talk about some of these issues. Sometimes we get so reluctant, we're going to say the wrong thing, and we don't say anything at all. And so these are just some tips and things that you can download or look at in the books that really help you navigate some of those things that are small but subtle barriers to really doing ministry with people with disabilities. So what is ministry with? It means sharing our lives together, certainly within the walls of our congregation, but just as, or maybe more important, beyond the walls of our congregation. It certainly means sitting together in Sunday school, praying together, sharing a hymnal, serving together as ushers, maybe being in a small group, or even catching up over coffee during the social hour. But I think more important, or at least as important, it also means that we're involved in each other's lives between Sundays, between and beyond the walls of our congregation, that we're checking in with one another throughout the week. We're sharing a meal, we're finding out how work is going, or the search for a job is going, or just lending a helping hand. Life happens 7 days a week, 52 days a year, and so does ministry. It happens in those encounters and those relationships that spill over after the benediction. And that's a piece I'll really talk about this afternoon, about what that looks like. Now, I don't know what ministry with is going to look like for a particular family. And so I think it's wise to find out from them, ask them, don't make assumptions about what it would look like. And I want you to kind of just consider some data from the families that we talked to. Study of almost 500 families, parents of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We said, have you ever even been asked by someone at your place of worship the best way to include your child in worship services? Guess what? Less than half had ever even been asked what that looks like. Most had never been asked. So what does that look like for you? Maybe it's taking a family out to coffee and saying, hell, tell me about your child. What are the things she loves about Sunday morning? What are the things that we should definitely avoid? And what can we do to make Sunday morning the best day of the week for your child? And then, as parents have shared that with us, we then do the asking for them. So we don't put parents in a position where they're the ones having to do the advocating. They're advocating at school, at work, in the medical offices, everywhere else. And frankly, many of them don't want to have to do that kind of asking in their faith community, anywhere but there. So we'll share this with you as a way to spark your creativity in thinking about what families might benefit from in terms of supports. We asked in another study of almost 500 Tennessee families, we asked them to think about a variety of supports that might come from their church. And we said, assuming this is available, assuming your church did this, how helpful would this be in raising your son or daughter with an intellectual or developmental disability? And I've put these on the screen in order from most to least beneficial. The thing that they found to be most potentially helpful, 70% of these parents said just some sort of disability awareness efforts in our broader congregation. Nearly 70%, 68% said some person who kind of is the point person for families who can be our advocate, who can do asking for us so we don't have to do that asking in congregations. Some sort of resources or help connections for families. Some sort of spiritual counseling from a congregational leader, a support group for parents, respite care, modifications to religious education, a spiritual education plan, support in religious education programs, support during worship services, and on and on and on. I put this up here not to tell you to do all these different things, but to illustrate possibilities that you might pursue. These are things that families in general might find helpful. And here's the opportunity. It's the distance between the blue bars and the numbers that I'm about to put up on your screen, because this is the percentage of congregations that actually offer any of these things. Only 10% do any kind of disability awareness. Only 6% have any person families can talk to be that advocate. Only 8% have respite care of any kind. Only 1 out of 3 congregations, parents say there's spiritual counseling available from their clergy. The opportunity is in this gap for you as congregations. Now, I flashed that on your screen really quickly. We've developed a guide for congregation leaders that walks through what it looks like to put all 14 of those supports in place and in practice. And I'd encourage you to download that and look at it. So those supports become really, really important. And I'm going to start speeding up here a little bit because I normally teach a 3-hour class, and I just got the signal that that's not appropriate. I think congregation leaders are going to be really instrumental in casting this vision, one that permeates the congregation. And what people hear from the pulpit is going to make all the difference in how people respond throughout that congregation. Think about how you might do some sort of inclusion awareness services in your congregation. There's great resources. They're in your handouts. You can download guides on how to do that. There's a number of awesome resources out there. But I want to conclude by taking to, I think, what is really the most powerful of these prepositions, and that's ministry by people with disabilities. Because as more and more congregations expand their welcome, a recurring theme of these efforts is that communities are strengthened by the presence of people with disabilities. And that lesson shouldn't come as any surprise to this audience, because that's how God designed community. We've all been given gifts, we've all been given talents, and they work in tandem to further God's kingdom. And that includes the unrecognized gifts often of people with disabilities. People who have lived their lives in community with people with disabilities talk often about these gifts. They remind us that our preconceived notions of who is the giver and the receiver, who's the server, who's the one being served, who's the one who has something to offer, and who's the one who has something that in need, those quickly get overturned, and they're not nearly as static roles as we might presume. So how many people of faith go their entire lives without meeting and getting to know this segment of their community, and how many congregations are missing out on the wonderful opportunity to receive these gifts. So where are you as a congregation? Where are you on this journey? Do you find yourself in ministry apart from, doing ministry to, among, with, or by, or are you in most of those places? As long as you're not in the first, I'm thrilled, right? How do you move further on that journey? In your book, I've put a reflection tool that kind of helps you walk through as a team what our starting points are and next steps might be. I'd encourage you to look through that tool and think about where you might go next. And I think you're going to find throughout the rest of this day that the speakers on the panel are going to give you more and more ideas about what that might look like.